This is Audible.
The Horus Heresy. False Gods. The Heresy Takes Root. By Graham McNeill. Read by Toby Longworth. Part 1. The Betrayer. I was there the day that Horus fell. It is the folly of men to believe that they are great players on the stage of history, that their actions might affect the grand procession that is the passage of time. It is an insulating conceit a powerful man might clasp tight to his bosom, that he might sleep away the night, safe in the knowledge that but for his presence the world would not turn, the mountains would crumble, and the seas dry up. But if the remembrance of history has taught us anything, it is that in time all things will pass. Unnumbered civilizations before ours are naught but dust and bones, and the greatest heroes of their age are forgotten legends. No man lives forever, and even as memory fades, so too will any remembrance of him. It is a universal truth, and an unavoidable law that cannot be denied, despite the protestations of the vain, the arrogant, and the tyrannical. Horus was the exception. Kirill Sinderman, Preface to the Remembrances. It would take 1,000 clichés to describe the War Master, each one truer than the last. Petronella Viva, Palatina Maioria of House Carpinus. Everything degenerates in the hands of men. Ignace Carcassy, Meditations on the Elegiac Hero. 1. Scion of Terror. Colossi. Rebel Moon. Cyclopean Magnus, Rogel Dawn, Lehman Russ. Names that rang with history. Names that shaped history. Her eyes roamed further up the list. Corax, Night Haunter, Angron. And so on through a legacy of heroism and conquest, of worlds reclaimed in the name of the Emperor as part of the ever-expanding imperium of man. It thrilled her just to hear the names in her head. But greater than any of them was the name at the top of the list. Horus, the War Master. Lupercal, she heard his soldiers now called him, an affectionate nickname for their beloved commander. It was a name earned in the fires of battle, on Ulanor, on murder, on 6319, a world the deluded inhabitants had in their ignorance known as terror. And 1,000 other battles she had not yet committed to her mnemonic implants. The thought that she was so very far from the sprawling family estates of Kairos and would soon set foot on the vengeful spirit to record living history took her breath away. But she was here to do more than simply record history unfolding. She knew, deep in her soul, that Horus was history. She ran a hand through her long, midnight black hair, swept up in a style considered chic in the Terran court. Not that anyone this far out in space would know, allowing her fingernails to trace a path down her smooth, unblemished skin. Her olive-skinned features had been carefully molded by a life of wealth and facial sculpting to be regal and distinguished, with just the fashionable amount of aloofness crafted into the proud sweep of her jawline. Tall and striking, she sat at her maple-wood escritoire, a family heirloom her father proudly boasted had been a gift from the Emperor to his great-great-grandmother after the great oath-taking in the Urals. She tapped on her data slate with a gold-tipped Nemo quill, its reactive nib twitching in response to her excitement. Random words crawled across the softly glowing surface, the quill's organic stem crystals picking up the surface thoughts from her frontal lobes. Crusade. Hero. Savior. Destroyer. She smiled and erased the words with a swipe of an elegantly manicured nail. The edge smoothed down to the fractal level, and began to write with pronounced, cursive sweeps of the quill. It is with great heart and a solemn sense of honour that I, Petronella Viva, Palatina Majoria of House Carpinus, do pen these words. For many a long year I have journeyed from terror, enduring many travails and inconveniences. Petronella frowned and quickly erased the words she had written, angry at having copied the unnatural affectedness that so infuriated her in the remembrances scripts that had been sent back from the leading edge of the Great Crusade. Cinderman's texts in particular irritated her, though of late they had become few and far between. Dion Fraster produced some passable symphonics, nothing that would enjoy more than a day or so of favour in the Terran ballrooms, but pleasing enough. And the landscapes of Kiel and Roger were certainly vibrant, but possessed a hyperbole of brushstrokes that she felt was unwarranted. Ignace Carcassy had written some passable poems, but they painted a picture of the Great Crusade she often thought unflattering to such a wondrous undertaking, especially blood through misunderstanding, and she often asked herself why the War Master allowed him to pen such words. She wondered if perhaps the subtexts of the poetry went over his head, and then laughed at the thought that anything could get past one such as Horace. She sat back on her chair and placed the quill in the Leith well, as a sudden, treacherous doubt gnawed at her. She was so critical of the other remembrances, but had yet to test her own mettle amongst them. Could she do any better? Could she meet with the greatest hero of the age, a god, some called him, although that was a ridiculous, outmoded concept these days, and achieve what they had, in her opinion, singularly failed to do? Who was she to believe that her paltry skill could do justice to the mighty tales the War Master was forging, hot on the anvil of battle? Then she remembered her lineage, and her posture straightened. Was she not of House Carpinus, finest and most influential of the noble houses in Terran aristocracy? Had not House Carpinus chronicled the rise of the Emperor and his domain throughout the wars of unification, watching it grow from a planet-spanning empire to one that was even now reaching from one side of the galaxy to the other to reclaim mankind's lost realm? As though seeking further reassurance, Petronella opened a flat blotting folder with a monogrammed leather cover and slid a sheaf of papers from inside it. At the top of the pile was a picked image of a fair-haired Astartes in burnished plate, kneeling before a group of his peers as one of them presented a long, trailing parchment to him. Petronella knew that these were called oaths of moment, vows sworn by warriors before battle to pledge their skill and devotion to the coming fight. An intertwined EK device in the corner of the pict identified it as one of Euphrates Keeler's images, and though she was loath to give any of the remembrancers credit, this piece was simply wondrous. Smiling, she slid the pick to one side to reveal a piece of heavy-grain cartridge paper beneath. The paper bore the familiar double-headed eagle watermark, representing the union of the Mechanicum of Mars and the Emperor, and the script was written in the short, angular strokes of the sigillite's hand, the quick pen strokes and half-finished letters speaking of a man writing in a hurry. The upward slant to the tails of the high letters indicated that he had a great deal on his mind, though why that should be so, now that the Emperor had returned to Terra, she did not know. She smiled as she studied the letter for what must have been the 100th time since she had left the port at Gyptus, knowing that it represented the highest honour accorded to her family. A shiver of anticipation travelled along her spine as she heard far-distant klaxons and a distorted automated voice coming from the gold-rimmed speakers in the corridor outside her suite declared that her vessel had entered high anchor around the planet. She had arrived. Petronella pulled a silver sash beside the escritoire, and, barely a moment later, the door chime rang, and she smiled, knowing without turning that only Maggard would have answered her summons so quickly. Though he never uttered a word in her presence, nor ever would, thanks to the surgery she'd had the family chaperones administer, she always knew when he was near, by the agitated jitter of her Nemo quill, as it reacted to the cold steel bite of his mind. She spun around in her deeply cushioned chair and said, "Open." The door swung smoothly open, and she let the moment hang as Maggard waited for permission to stand in her presence. "I give you leave to enter," she said, and watched as her dour bodyguard of 20 years smoothly crossed the threshold into her frescoed suite of gold and scarlet. His every move was controlled and tight, as though his entire body, from the hard, sculpted muscles of his legs to his wide, powerful shoulders, was in tension. He moved to the side as the door shut behind him, his dancing golden eyes sweeping the vaulted filigreed ceiling and the adjacent anterooms in a variety of spectra for anything suspect. He kept one hand on the smooth grip of his pistol, the other on the grip of his gold-bladed Curlian rapier. His bare arms bore the faint scars of augmetic surgery, pale lines across his dark skin, as did the tissue around his eyes where house chirurgeons had replaced them with expensive biometric spectral enhancers to enable him better to protect the scion of House Carpinus. Clad in gold armor of flexing rigid bands and silver mail, Maggard nodded in unsmiling acknowledgment that all was clear, though Petronella could have told him that without all his fussing. But since his life was forfeit should anything untoward befall her, she supposed she could understand his caution. "Where is Babeth?" asked Petronella, slipping the sigillite's letter back into the blotter and lifting the Nemo quill from the Leithwell. She placed the nib on the data slate and cleared her mind, allowing Maggard's thoughts to shape the words his throat could not, frowning as she read what appeared. "She has no business being asleep," said Petronella. "Wake her. I am to be presented to the mightiest hero of the Great Crusade, and I'm not going before him looking as though I've just come from some stupid pilgrim riot on Terra. Fetch her and have her bring the velveteen gown, the crimson one with the high collars. I'll expect her within 5 minutes." Maggard nodded and withdrew from her presence, but not before she felt the delicious thrill of excitement as the Nemo quill twitched in her grip and scratched the last few words on the data slate. "Ing bitch." In one of the ancient tongues of Terra, its name meant Day of Wrath, and Jonah Arucan knew that the name was well deserved. Rearing up before him like some ancient god of a forgotten time, the Deus Irae stood as a vast monument to war and destruction, its armored head staring proudly over the assembled ground crew that milled around it like worshippers. The Imperator-class Titan represented the pinnacle of the Mechanicum's skill and knowledge, the culmination of millennia of war and military technology. The Titan had no purpose other than to destroy, and had been designed with all the natural affinity for the business of killing that mankind possessed. Like some colossal armored giant of steel, the Titan stood 43 meters tall on crenellated bastion legs, each one capable of mounting a full company of soldiers and their associated supporting troops. Jonah watched as a long banner of gold and black was unfurled between the Titan's legs, like the loincloth of some feral savage, emblazoned with the death's head symbol of the Legio Mortis. Scores of curling scrolls, each bearing the name of a glorious victory won by the War Master, were stitched to the honor banner, and Jonah knew that there would be many more added before the Great Crusade was over. Thick, ribbed cables snaked from the shielded power cores in the hangar's ceiling towards the Titan's armored torso, where the mighty war engine's plasma reactor was fed with the power of a caged star. Its adamantine hull was scarred and pitted with the residue of battle, the tech adepts still patching it up after the fight against the megarachnid. Nevertheless, it was a magnificent and humbling sight, though not one that could dull the ache in his head and the churning in his belly from too much amasec the night before. Giant rumbling cranes suspended from the ceiling lifted massive hoppers of shells and long, snub-nosed missiles into the launch bays of the Titan's weapon mounts. Each gun was the size of a hab block, massive rotary cannons, long-range howitzers, and a monstrous plasma cannon with the power to level cities. He watched the ordnance crews prep the weapons, feeling the familiar flush of pride and excitement as he made his way towards the Titan, and smiled at the obvious masculine symbolism of a Titan being made ready for war. He jumped as a gurney laden with Vulcan bolter shells sped past him, just barely avoiding him as it negotiated its way at speed through the organized chaos of ground personnel, Titan crews and deckhands. It squealed to a halt and the driver's head snapped around. "Watch where the hell you're going, you damn fool!" shouted the driver, rising from his seat and striding angrily towards him. "You Titan crewmen think you can swan about like pirates. Well, this is my—" The words died in the man's throat, and he snapped to attention as he saw the garnet studs and the winged skull emblem on the shoulder boards of Jonah's uniform jacket that marked him as a Moderati Primus of the Dies Irae. "Sorry," smiled Jonah, spreading his arms in a gesture of amused apology as he watched the man fight the urge to say more. "Didn't see you there, Chief. Got a hell of a hangover. Anyway, what the devil are you doing driving so fast? You could have killed me." "You just walked out in front of me, sir," said the man, staring fixedly at a point just over Jonah's shoulder. "Did I? Well, just be more careful next time," said Jonah, already walking away. "And watch where you're going," hissed the man under his breath, before climbing back onto his gurney and driving off. "You be careful now," Jonah called after the driver, imagining the colourful insults the man would already be cooking up about those damned Titan crewmen to tell his fellow ground staff. The hangar, though over 2 kilometres in length, felt cramped to Jonah as he made his way towards the Dies Irae. The scent of engine oil, grease and sweat not helping one whit with his hangover. A host of battle titans of the Legio Mortis stood ready for war. Fast, mid-range reavers, snarling warhounds, and the mighty warlords, as well as some newer Knight Gaunt-class titans. But none could match the awesome splendor of an Imperator-class titan. The Dies Irae dwarfed them all in size, power, and magnificence, and Jonah knew there was nothing in the galaxy that could stand against such a terrifying war machine. Jonah adjusted his collar and fastened the brass buttons of his jacket, straightening it over his stocky frame before he reached the Titan's wide feet. He ran his hands through his shoulder-length black hair, trying to give the impression, at least, that he hadn't slept in his clothes. He could see the thin, angular form of Titus Cassar, his fellow Moderati Primus, working behind a monitoring terminal, and had no wish to endure another lecture on the 99 virtues of the Emperor. Apparently, smartness of appearance was one of the most important. "Good morning, Titus," he said, keeping his tone light. Cassar's head bobbed up in surprise, and he quickly slid a folded pamphlet beneath a sheaf of readiness reports. "You're late," he said, recovering quickly. "Reveille was an hour ago, and punctuality is the hallmark of the pious man." "Don't start with me, Titus," said Jonah, reaching over and snatching the pamphlet that Cassar had been so quick to conceal. Cassar made to stop him, but Jonah was too quick, brandishing the pamphlet before him. "If Princeps Turnit catches you reading this, you'll be a gunnery servitor before you know what's hit you." "Give it back, Jonah, please." "I'm not in the mood for another sermon from this damned Lectitio Divinitatis chapbook." "Fine, I'll put it away. Just give it back, all right?" Jonah nodded and held the well-thumbed paper out to Cassar, who snatched it back and quickly slid it inside his uniform jacket. Rubbing his temples with the heel of his palms, Jonah said, "Anyway, what's the rush? It's not as though the old girl's even ready for the pre-deployment checks, is she?" "I pray you'll stop referring to it as a she, Jonah. It smacks of pagan anthropomorphizing," said Cassar. "A Titan is a war machine, nothing more. Steel, adamantine, and plasma, with flesh and blood controlling it." "How can you say that?" asked Arukin, sauntering over to a steel-plated leg section and climbing the steps to the arched gates that led within. He slapped his palm on the thick metal and said, "She's obviously a she, Titus. Look at the shapely legs, the curve of the hips. And doesn't she carry us within her like a mother protecting her unborn children?" "In mockery are the seeds of impiety sown," said Cassar without a trace of irony. "And I will not have it." "Oh, come on, Titus," said Arukin, warming to his theme. "Don't you feel it when you're inside her? Don't you hear the beat of her heart in the rumble of her reactor, or feel the fury of her wrath in the roar of her guns?" Cassar turned back to the monitoring panel and said, "No, I do not. And I do not wish to hear any more of your foolishness. We are already behind on our pre-deployment checks. Princeps Turnit will have our hides nailed to the hull if we are not ready." "Where is the Princeps?" asked Jonah, suddenly serious. "With the War Council," said Kassar. Aruka nodded and descended the steps of the Titan's foot, joining Kassar at the monitoring station and letting fly with one last jibe. Just because you've never had the chance to enjoy a woman doesn't mean I'm not right. Kassar gave him a withering glare and said, Enough! The War Council will be done soon, and I'll not have it said that the Legio Mortis wasn't ready to do the Emperor's bidding. You mean Horus's bidding, corrected Jonah. We have been over this before, my friend, said Kassar. Horus's authority comes from the Emperor. We forget that at our peril. That's as maybe. But it's been many a dark and bloody day since we fought with the Emperor beside us, hasn't it? But hasn't Horus always been there for us on every battlefield? Indeed he has. And for that I'd follow him into battle beyond the halo stars, nodded Kassar. But even the War Master has to answer to the God Emperor. God Emperor? Hissed Jonah, leaning in close as he saw a number of the ground crew turn their heads towards them. Listen, Titus. You have to stop this God Emperor rubbish. One day, you're going to say that to the wrong person, and you'll get your skull cracked open. Besides, even the Emperor himself says he's not a god. Only the truly divine deny their divinity, said Kassar, quoting from his book. Jonah raised his hands in surrender and said, All right, have it your way, Titus. But don't say I didn't warn you. The righteous have nothing to fear from the wicked, and spare me another lesson on ethics, Titus, sighed Jonah, turning away and watching as a detachment of Imperial Army soldiers marched into the hangar, las rifles on canvas slings hanging from their shoulders. Any word yet on what we're going to be fighting on this rock? Asked Jonah, changing the subject. I hope it's the Greenskin. We still owe them for the destruction of Vulcus Tor on Ulanor. Do you think it will be the Greenskin? Kassar shrugged. I don't know, Jonah. Does it matter? We fight who we are ordered to fight. I'd just like to know. You will know when Princeps Turnit returns, said Kassar. Speaking of which, hadn't you better prepare the command deck for his return? Jonah nodded, knowing that his fellow Moderati was right, and that he'd wasted enough time in baiting him. Senior Princeps Esau Turnit's reputation as a feared, ruthless warrior was well deserved, and he ran a tight ship on the Dies Irae. Titan crews might be permitted more leeway in their behavior than the common soldiery, but Turnit brooked no such laxity in the crew of his Titan. You're right, Titus. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, said Kassar, pointing to the gateway in the Titan's leg. Be ready. Jonah sketched a quick salute and jogged up the steps, leaving Kassar to finish prepping the Titan for refueling. He made his way past embarking soldiers who grumbled as he pushed them aside. Some raised their voices, but upon seeing his uniform and knowing that their lives might soon depend on him, they quickly silenced their objections. Jonah halted at the entrance to the Titan, taking a second to savor the moment as he stood at the threshold. He tilted his head back and looked up at the height of the soaring machine, taking a deep breath as he passed through the tall, eagle and lightning bolt-wreathed gateway and entered the Titan. He was bathed in red light as he entered the cold, hard interior of the Titan and began threading his way through the low-ceilinged corridors with a familiarity born of countless hours learning the position of every rivet and bolt that held the Dies Irae together. There wasn't a corner of the Titan that Jonah didn't know. Every passageway, every hatch, and every secret the old girl had in her belonged to him. Even Titus and Princeps Turnit didn't know the Dies Irae as well as he did. Reaching the end of a narrow corridor, Jonah approached a thick iron door guarded by 2 soldiers in burnished black breastplates over silver mail shirts. Each wore a mask fashioned in the shape of the Legio's death's head and was armed with a short jolt stick and a holstered shock pistol. They tensed as he came into view, but relaxed a fraction as they recognized him. Jonah nodded to the soldiers and said, Moderati Primus, moving from lower levels to mid-levels. The nearest soldier nodded and indicated a glassy black panel beside the door as the other drew his pistol. Its muzzle was slightly flared, and 2 silver steel prongs protruded threateningly. sparks of blue light flickering between them. Arcs of light could leap out and sear the flesh from a man's bones in a burst of lightning, but wouldn't dangerously ricochet in the cramped confines of a Titan's interior. Jonah pressed his palm against the panel and waited as the yellow beam scanned his hand. A light above the door flashed green, and the nearest soldier reached over and turned a hatch wheel that opened the door. "Thanks," said Jonah, and passed through, finding himself in one of the screw stairs that climbed the inside of the Titan's leg. The narrow iron mesh stairs curled around thick, fiber-bundle muscles and throbbing power cables, wreathed in a shimmering energy field. But Jonah paid them no mind, too intent on his roiling stomach as he climbed the hot, stuffy stairs. He had to pause to catch his breath halfway up and wiped a hand across his sweaty brow before reaching the next level. This high up, the air was cooler as powerful recyc units dispersed the heat generated by the venting of plasma gases from the reactor. Hooded adepts of the Mechanicum tended to flickering control panels as they carefully built up the plasma levels in the reactor. Crewmen passed him along the cramped confines of the Titan's interior, saluting as they passed him. Good men crewed the Dies Irae. They had to be good. Princeps Turnit would never have picked them otherwise. All the men and women on board the Titan had been chosen personally for their expertise and dedication. Eventually, Jonah reached the Moderati chambers in the heart of the Titan and slid his authenticator into the slot beside the door. "Moderati Primus Jonah Arukan," he said. The lock mechanism clicked, and with a chime, the door slid open. Inside was a brilliant domed chamber with curving walls of shining metal and half a dozen openings spaced evenly throughout the ceiling. Jonah stood in the center of the room and said, "Command bridge. Moderati Primus Jonah Arukan." The floor beneath him shimmered and rippled like mercury, a perfectly circular disk of mirror-like metal forming beneath his feet and lifting him from the ground. The thin disk climbed into the air, and Jonah rose through a hole in the ceiling, passing along the transport tube towards the summit of the Titan. The walls of the tube glowed with their own inner light, and Jonah stifled a yawn as the silver disk came to a halt, and he emerged onto the command deck. The interior of the Dies Irae's head section was wide and flat, with recessed bays in the floor to either side of the main gangway, where hooded adepts and servitors interfaced directly with the deep core functions of the colossal machine. "And how is everyone this fine morning?" he asked no one in particular. "Ready to take the fight to the heathens once more?" As usual, no one answered him, and Jonah shook his head with a smile as he made his way to the front of the bridge, already feeling his hangover receding at the thought of meshing with the command interface. 3 padded chairs occupied a raised dais before the glowing green tactical viewer, each with thick bundles of insulated cables trailing from the arms and headrests. He slid past the central chair, that of Princeps Turnit, and sat in the chair to the right, sliding into the comfortable groove he'd worn in the creaking leather over the years. "Adepts," he said, "link me." Red-robed adepts of the Mechanicum appeared, one on either side of him, their movements slow and in perfect concert with one another, and slotted fine microcellular gauntlets over his hands, the inner mnemonic surfaces meshing with his skin and registering his vital signs. Another adept lowered a silver lattice of encephalographic sensors onto his head, and the touch of the cool metal. "Hold still, Moderati," said the adept behind him, "is are ready to deploy." Jonah heard the hiss of the neck clamps as they slid from the side of the headrest, and, from the corners of his eyes, he could see slithering slivers of metal emerging from the clamps. He braced himself for the momentary pain of connection as they slid across his cheek like silver worms reaching towards his eyes. Then he could see them fully. Incredibly fine silver wires, each no thicker than a human hair, yet capable of carrying vast amounts of information. The clamps gripped his head firmly as the silver wires descended and penetrated the corners of his eyes, worming down past his optic nerve and into his brain, where they finally interfaced directly with his cerebral cortex. He grunted as the momentary icy pain of connection passed through his brain, but relaxed as he felt the body of the Titan become one with his own. Information flooded through him, the cortical dendrites filtering it through portions of his brain that normally went unused, allowing him to feel every part of the gigantic machine as though it were an extension of his own flesh. Within microseconds, the post-hypnotic implants in the subconscious portions of his brain were already running the pre-deployment checks, and the insides of his eyeballs lit up with telemetry data, weapon readiness status, fuel levels, and a million other nuggets of information that would allow him to command this beautiful, wonderful Titan. "How do you feel?" asked the adept, and Jonah laughed. "It's good to be the king," he said. As the first pinpricks of light flared in the sky, Akshub knew that history had come to her world. She gripped her fetish-hung staff directly in her clawed hand, knowing that a moment in time had dawned that mankind would never forget, heralding a day when the gods themselves would step from myth and legend to hammer out the future in blood and fire. She had waited for this day, since the great warriors from the sky had brought word of the sacred task appointed to her when she was little more than a babe in arms. As the great red orb of the sun rose in the north, hot, dry winds brought the sour fragrance of bitter blossoms from the tomb-littered valleys of long-dead emperors. Standing high in the mountains, she watched this day of days unfold below her, tears of rapture spilling down her wrinkled cheeks from her black, oval eyes, as the pinpricks of light became fiery trails, streaking across the clouds towards the ground. Below her, great herds of horned beasts trekked across the verdant savannah, sweeping towards their watering holes in the south, before the day grew too hot for them to move, and the swift, razor-fanged predators emerged from their rocky burrows. Flocks of wide, pinioned birds wheeled over the highest peaks of the mountains above her, their cries raucous yet musical, as this momentous day grew older. All the multitudinous varieties of life carried on in their usual ways, oblivious to the fact that events that would change the fate of the galaxy were soon to unfold on this unremarkable world. On this day of days, only she truly appreciated it. The first wave of drop pods landed around the central massif at exactly 16:04 Zulu time, the screaming jets of their retros bringing them in on fiery pillars as they breached the lower atmosphere. Stormbirds followed, like dangerously graceful birds of prey, swooping in on some hapless victim. Black and scorched by the heat of re-entry, the 30 drop pods sent up great clouds of dust and earth from their impacts, their wide doors opening with percussive booms and clanging down on the steppe. 300 warriors in thick plate armor swiftly disembarked from the drop pods and fanned out with mechanical precision, quickly linking up with other squads and forming a defensive perimeter around an unremarkable patch of ground in the center of their landing pattern. Stormbirds circled above in overlapping racetrack patterns, as though daring anything to approach. At some unseen signal, the Stormbirds broke formation and rose into the sky as the boxy form of a thunderhawk descended from the clouds, its belly blackened and trailing blue-white contrails. The larger craft surrounded the smaller one, like mother hens protecting a chick, escorting it to the surface, where it landed in a billowing cloud of red dust. The Stormbirds screamed away on prescribed patrol circuits as the forward ramp of the Thunderhawk groaned open, the hiss of pressurized air gusting from within. 10 warriors, clad in the comb-crested helms and shimmering plate armor of the Sons of Horus, marched from the gunship, cloaks of many colors billowing at their shoulders. Each carried a golden bolter across his chest, and their heads turned from left to right as they searched for threats. Behind them came a living god, his armor gleaming gold and ocean green, with a cloak of regal purple framing him perfectly. A single carved red eye stared out from his breastplate, and a wreath of laurels sat upon his perfect brow. "Davin," sighed Horus, "I never thought I'd see this place again." 2. You bleed. A good war. until the galaxy burns. A time to listen. Mercedy Ollerton forced herself to watch the blade stab towards Loken, knowing that this strike must surely end his life. But, as always, he swayed aside from the lethal sweep with a speed that belied his massive Astartes frame, and raised his sword in time to block yet another stabbing cut. A heavy cudgel looped down at his head, but he had obviously anticipated the blow and ducked as it slashed over him. The armatures of the practice cage clattered as the weapons swung, stabbed and slashed through the air, mindlessly seeking to dismember the massive Astartes warrior who fought within. Loken grunted, his hard-muscled body shining with a gleaming layer of sweat as a blade scored his upper arm, and Mercedy winced as a thin line of blood ran from his bicep. As far as she could remember, it was the first time she had ever seen him wounded in the practice cages. The smirking blonde giant, Sedire, and Loken's friend, Vipers, had long ago left the training halls, leaving her alone with the captain of 10th Company. Flattered as she was that he'd asked her to watch him train, she soon found herself wishing that he would finish this punishing ritual so that they could talk about what had happened on Davin and the events that now led them to war on its moon. Sitting on the cold iron benches outside the practice cages, she had already blink-clicked more images to store in her memory coils than she would ever need. Moreover, if she was honest, the sheer obsessiveness of Loken's desperate sparring was somehow unsettling. She had watched him spar before, but it had always been an adjunct to their normal discussions, never the focus. This was something else. It was as though the captain of the Lunar Wolves— no, not the Lunar Wolves, she reminded herself. The Sons of Horus. As Loken deflected yet another slashing blade, she checked her internal chronometer again and knew that she would have to leave soon. Carcassy wouldn't wait, his prodigious appetite outweighing any notion of courtesy towards her, and he would head for the iterator's luncheon in the ship's staterooms without her. There would be copious amounts of free wine there, and, despite Ignace's newfound dedication to the cause of remembrance, she did not relish the thought of such a smorgasbord of alcohol landing in his path again. She pushed thoughts of Carcassy aside as the hissing mechanical hemispheres of the sparring cage withdrew and a bell began chiming. Loken stepped from the cage, his fair hair, longer than she had seen it before, plastered to his scalp, and his lightly freckled face flushed with exertion. "You're hurt," she said, passing him a towel from the bench. He looked down, as though unaware of the wound. "It's nothing," he said, wiping away the already clotted blood. His breathing came in short bursts, and she tried to mask her surprise. To see an Astartes out of breath was utterly alien to her. How long had he been training before she had arrived in the halls? Loken wiped the sweat from his face and upper body as he made his way to his personal arming chamber. Mercedy followed him, and, as usual, could not help but admire the sheer physical perfection of his enhanced physique. The ancient tribes of the Olympian hegemony were said to have called such specimens of physical perfection Adonian, and the word fit Loken like a masterfully crafted suit of Mark IV plate. Almost without thinking, Mercedy blink-clicked the image of his body. "You're staring," said Loken, without turning. Momentarily flustered, she said, "Sorry, I didn't mean—" He laughed. "I'm teasing. I don't mind. If I'm to be remembered, I'd like it to be when I was at my peak, rather than as a toothless old man drooling into my gruel." "I didn't realize Astartes aged," she replied, regaining her composure. Loken shrugged, picking up a carved vambrace and a polishing cloth. "I don't know if we do either. None of us has ever lived long enough to find out." Her sense for things unsaid told her that she could use this angle in a chapter of her remembrances, if he would talk more on the subject. The melancholy of the immortal, or the paradox of an ageless being caught in the flux of constantly changing times, struggling flies in the clotting amber of history. She realized she was getting ahead of herself and asked, "Does that bother you, not getting old? Is there some part of you that wants to?" Why would I want to get old? Asked Loken, opening his tin of lapping powder and applying it to the vambrace. Its new colour, a pale greenish-hued metallic, still unfamiliar to her. Do you? No, she admitted, unconsciously reaching up to touch the smooth black skin of her hairless augmetic scalp. No, I don't. To be honest, it scares me. Does it scare you? No. I've told you, I'm not built to feel like that. I am powerful now. Strong. Why would I want to change that? I don't know. I thought that if you aged, maybe you'd be able to, retire one day? Once the Great Crusade is over, I mean. Over? Yes. Once the fighting is done and the Emperor's realm is restored. Loken didn't answer immediately, instead continuing to polish his armor. She was about to ask the question again when he said, I don't know that it will ever be over, Mercedes. Since I joined the Mournival, I've spoken to a number of people who seem to think we'll never finish the Great Unification. Or, if we do, that it won't last. She laughed. Sounds like you've been spending too much time with Ignace. Has his poetry taken a turn for the maudlin again? He shook his head. No. Then what is it? What makes you like this? Those books you've been borrowing from Zinderman? No, repeated Loken, his pale grey eyes darkening at the mention of the venerable primary iterator, and she sensed that he would not be drawn any further on the subject. Instead, she stored this conversation away for another time, one when he might be more forthcoming on these uncharacteristically gloomy thoughts. She decided to ask another question and steer the conversation in a more upbeat direction, when a looming shadow fell over the pair of them, and she turned to see the massive slab-like form of First Captain Abaddon towering over her. As usual, his long hair was pulled up in its silver-sheathed topknot, the rest of his scalp shaved bare. The captain of the First Company of the Sons of Horus was dressed in simple sparring fatigues and carried a monstrous sword with a toothed edge. He glared disapprovingly at Mercedes. First Captain Abaddon, she began, bowing her head, but he cut her off. You bleed, said Abaddon, and took Loken's arm in his powerful grip, the sonorous tone of his voice only accentuating his massive bulk. The sparring machine drew Astarte's blood. Loken glanced at the bulging muscle where the blade had cut across the black, double-headed eagle tattoo there. Yes, Ezekiel. It was a long session and I was getting tired. It's nothing. Abaddon grunted and said, You're getting soft, Loken. Perhaps if you spent more time in the company of warriors than troublesome poets and inquisitive scriveners, you'd be less inclined to such tiredness. Perhaps, agreed Loken, and Mercedes could sense the crackling tension between the two Astartes. Abaddon nodded curtly to Loken and gave her a last barbed glance before turning away to the sparring cages, his sword buzzing into throaty life. Mercedes watched Loken's eyes as they followed Abaddon, and saw something she never expected to see there. Wariness. What was all that about? She asked. Did it have anything to do with what happened on Darwin? Loken shrugged. I can't say. Davin. The melancholy ruins scattered throughout its deserts told of its once civilized culture. But the anarchy of old night had destroyed whatever society had once prospered many centuries before. Now Davin was a feral world, swept by hot, arid winds, and baking under the baleful red eye of a sun. It had been 6 decades since Loken had last set foot on Davin, though back then it had been known as 63-8, being the 8th world brought into compliance by the 63rd Expeditionary Force. Compliance had not improved it much, in his opinion. Its surface was hard, baked clay, clumped with scrubby vegetation and forests of tall, powerfully scented trees. Habitation was limited to primitive townships along the fertile river valleys, though there were many nomadic tribes that made their lonely way across the mighty, serpent-infested deserts. Loken well remembered the battles they'd fought to bring this world into compliance. Short, sharp conflicts with the autochthonic warrior castes who made war upon one another and whose internecine conflicts had almost wiped them out. Though outnumbered and hopelessly outclassed, they had fought with great courage, before offering their surrender, after doing all that honour demanded. The Lunar Wolves had been impressed by their courage and willingness to accept the new order of their society, and the commander, not yet the war master, had decreed that his warriors could learn much from these brave opponents. Though the tribesmen were separated from the human genome by millennia of isolation and shared few physical traits with the settlers that came after the Astartes, Horus had allowed the feral tribesmen to remain, in light of their enthusiastic embracing of the imperial way of life. Iterators and remembrances had not yet become an official part of the Crusade fleets, but the civilians and scholars who hung on the coattails of the expeditionary forces moved amongst the populace and promulgated the glory and truth of the Imperium. They had been welcomed with open arms, thanks largely to the dutiful work undertaken by the chaplains of the 17th Legion, the word-bearers, in the wake of the conquest. It had been a good war, won rapidly, and, for the Lunar Wolves, bloodlessly. The defeated foe was brought into compliance quickly and efficiently, allowing the commander to leave Corferan of the word-bearers to complete the task of bringing the light of truth and enlightenment to Davin. Yes, it had been a good war. Or so he had thought. Sweat trickled down the back of his head and ran down the inside of his armor, its greenish metallic sheen still new and startling to him, even though it had been months since he had repainted it. He could have left the job to one of the Legion's many artificers, but had known on some bone-deep level that he must look to his battle gear himself, and thus had painstakingly repainted each armored segment single-handedly. He missed the pristine gleam of his white plate, but the War Master had decreed that the new color be adopted to accompany the Legion's new name, the Sons of Horus. Loken remembered the cheers and the cries of adoration laid at the feet of the War Master as his announcement had spread through the expedition. Fists punched the air, and throats were shouted hoarse with jubilation. Loken had joined in with the rest of his friends, but a ripple of unease had passed through him upon hearing his beloved Legion's new name. Torgadon, ever the joker, had noticed the momentary shadow pass over his face and said, "What's the matter? You wanted it to be the Sons of Loken?" Loken had smiled and said, "No, it's just what? Don't we deserve this? Hasn't the commander earned this honor?" "Of course, Tarek," nodded Loken, shouting to be heard over the deafening roar of the Legion's cheers. "More than anyone, he has earned it. But don't you think the name carries a whiff of self-aggrandizement to it?" "Self-aggrandizement?" laughed Torgadon. "Those remembrances that follow you around like whipped dogs must be teaching you new words. Come on, enjoy this and don't be such a starch ass." Tarek's enthusiasm had been contagious, and Loken had found himself once again cheering until his throat was raw. He could almost feel that rawness again as he took a deep breath of the sour, acrid winds of Davin that blew from the far north, wishing he could be anywhere else right now. It was not a world without beauty, but Loken did not like Davin, though he could not say what exactly bothered him about it. A sour unease had settled in his belly on the journey from Zenobia to Davin, but he had pushed it from his thoughts as he marched ahead of the commander onto the planet's surface. To someone from the nightmarish industrial caverns of Chthonia, Loken could not deny that Davin's wide-open spaces were intoxicatingly beautiful. To the west of them, soaring mountain peaks seemed to scrape the stars, and further north, Loken knew that there were valleys that plumbed the very depths of the earth, and fantastical tombs of ancient kings. Yes, they had waged a good war on Davin. Why, then, had the word-bearers brought them here again? Some hours before, on the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, Malakhurst had activated the data slate he held in his twisted claw of a hand. The skin fused and wet pink, despite the best efforts of the Legion apothecaries to restore it. He had scanned the contents of the communique within the slate once more, angry at the turn of phrase used by the petitioner. He did not relish the prospect of showing the message to the War Master, and briefly wondered if he could ignore it or pretend the missive had never come before him. But Malakhurst had not risen to become the War Master's equerry by insulating him from bad news. He sighed. These days the words of bland administrators carried the weight of the Emperor, and as much as Malakhurst wanted to, he could not ignore this message in particular. The War Master would never agree to it, but Malakhurst had to tell him. In a moment of weakness, Malakhurst turned and limped across the strategium deck towards the War Master's sanctum chamber. He would leave the slate on the War Master's table, for him to find in his own time. The sanctum door slid smoothly aside, revealing the dark and peaceful interior. Malakhurst enjoyed the solitude of the sanctum, the coolness of the air easing the pain of his raw skin and twisted spine. The only sound that broke the stillness of the sanctum was the breath rasping in his throat, the abnormal rearward curvature of his spine placing undue pressure on his lungs. Malakhurst shuffled painfully along the length of the smooth, surfaced oval table, reaching out to place the slate at its head, where the War Master sat. It has been too long since the Mournival gathered here, thought Malakhurst. Evening, Mal, said a voice from the shadows, sombre and tired. Malakhurst turned in surprise towards the source of the voice, dropping the slate to the table, ready to rebuke whoever had seen fit to violate the War Master's sanctum. A shape resolved out of the darkness, and he relaxed as he saw the familiar features of the commander, eerily red-lit from below by the light of his gorget. Fully armoured in his battle plate, the War Master sat at the back of the darkened sanctum, his elbows resting on his knees and his head held in his hands. "My lord," said Malakhurst, "is everything all right?" Horus stared at the terrazzo-tiled floor of the sanctum and rubbed the heels of his palms across his shaved skull. His noble tanned face and wide-spaced eyes were deep in shadow, and Malakhurst waited patiently for the War Master's answer. "I don't know any more, Mal," said Horus. Malakhurst felt a shiver travel down his ruined spine at the War Master's words. Surely he had misheard. To imagine that the War Master did not know something was inconceivable. "Do you trust me?" asked Horus suddenly. "Of course, sir," answered Malakhurst without pause. "Then what do you leave here for me that you don't dare bring me directly?" asked Horus, moving to the table and lifting the fallen data slate. Malakhurst hesitated. "Another burden you do not need, my lord. A remembrancer from Terra, one with friends in high places, it would seem. The sigillite, for one." "Petronella Viva, of House Carpinus," said Horus, reading the contents of the slate. "I know of her family. Her ancestors chronicled my father's rise back in the days before unification." "What she demands," spat Malakhurst, "is ridiculous." "Is it, Malakhurst? Am I so insignificant that I don't require remembrance?" Malakhurst was shocked. "So what are you talking about? You are the War Master, chosen by the Emperor, beloved by all, to be his regent in this great endeavour. The remembrances of this fleet may record every fact they witness, but without you they are nothing. Without you all of it is meaningless. You are above all men." "Above all men," chuckled Horus. "I like the sound of that. All I've ever wanted to do was to lead this crusade to victory and complete the work my father left me." "You are an example to us all, sir," said Malakhurst proudly. "I suppose that's all a man can hope for during his lifetime," nodded Horus. "To set an example. And when he is dead, to be an inspiration for history. Perhaps she will help me with that noble ideal." "Dead? You are a god amongst men, sir, immortal and beloved by all." "I know," shouted Horus, and Malakhurst recoiled before his sudden, volcanic rage. "Surely the Emperor would not have created such a being as me, with the ability to grasp the infinite, to exist only for this short span." "You're right, Mal. you and Erebus both. My father made me for immortality, and the galaxy should know of me. 10,000 years from now, I want my name to be known all across the heavens." Malakhurst nodded, the War Master's furious conviction intoxicating, and dropped painfully to one knee in supplication. "What would you have me do, my lord?" "Tell this Petronella Viva that she may have her audience. But it must be now," said Horus, his fearsome outburst quite forgotten. "And tell her that if she impresses me, I will allow her to be my personal documentarist for as long as she desires it." "Are you sure about this, sir?" "I am, my friend," smiled Horus. "Now get up off your knees. I know it pains you." Horus helped Malakhurst rise to his feet and gently placed his armored gauntlet on his equerry's shoulder. "Will you follow me, Mal?" asked the War Master. "No matter what occurs." "You are my lord and master, sir," swore Malakhurst. "I will follow you until the galaxy burns and the stars themselves go out." "That's all I ask, my friend," smiled Horus. "Now let's get ready to see what Erebus has to say for himself. Davin, eh? Who'd have thought we'd ever be back here?" 2 hours after making planetfall on Davin. The communication from Erebus of the word-bearers that had brought the 63rd expedition to Davin had spoken of an old tally, the settling of a dispute, but had said nothing of its cause or participants. After the carnage on Murder and the desperate extraction from the Extranus, Loken had expected a war zone of unremitting ferocity, but this war zone, if indeed it could be called that, was deathly quiet, hot, and peaceful. He didn't know whether to be disappointed or relieved. Horus had come to the same conclusion not long after they had landed, sniffing the air of Davin with a look of recognition. "There is no war here," he had said. "No war?" Abaddon had asked. "How can you tell?" "You learn, Ezekiel," said Horus. "The smell of burnt meat and metal, the fear and the blood. There is none of that on this world." "Then why are we here?" asked Aximand, reaching up to lift his plumed helmet clear of his head. "It would seem we are here because we have been summoned," replied Horus, his tone darkening, and Loken had not liked the sound of the word summoned coming from the War Master's lips. Who would dare to summon the War Master? The answer had come when a column of dust grew on the eastern horizon, and 8 boxy, tracked vehicles rumbled across the steppe towards them. Shadowed by the storm birds that had flown in with the War Master, the dark, brushed steel vehicles trailed guidons from their vox antenna, emblazoned with the heraldry of an Astartes legion. From the lead rhino, a great devotional trophy rack stood proud of the armored glacis, hung with golden eagles and books, and sporting jagged lightning bolts picked out in lapis lazuli. "Erebus," spat Loken. "Hold your tongue," warned Horus, as the rhinos had drawn closer, "and let me do the talking." Bizarrely, the yurt smelled of apples, although Ignace Carcassy could see no fruit in any of the carved wooden trays, just heaped cuts of meat that looked a little on the raw side for his Epicurean palate. He could swear he smelled apples. He glanced around the interior of the yurt, wondering if perhaps there was some local brew of cider on offer. A hairy-faced local with impenetrable black eyes had already offered him a shallow bowl of the local liquor, a foul-looking brew that smelled like curdled milk, but after catching a pointed glance from Euphrates Keeler, he'd politely declined. Like the drink, the yurt was crude, but had a primitive majesty to it that appealed to the romantic in him, though he was savvy enough to know that primitive was all very well and good unless you had to live there. Perhaps 100 people filled the yurt. Army officers, strategium adepts, a few remembrancers, scribes and military aides. All come for the commander's war council. Casting his gaze around the smoky interior, Carcassy had seen that he was in illustrious company indeed. Hector Varvarus, Lord Commander of the army, stood next to a hunched Astartes giant, swathed in cream-coloured robes, who Carcassy knew must be the War Master's equerry, Malaghurst. An unsmiling figure in the black uniform of a Titan commander stood to attention at the forefront of the gathering, and Carcassy recognized the jowly features of Princeps Esau Turnit, commander of the Imperator Titan, Dies Irae. Turnit's Titan had led the armada of enormous battle machines into the heart of the Megarachnid territory on Murder, and had earned the Legio Mortis the lion's share of the glory. Carcassy remembered the huge Titan that towered over the architectural presentation that Peter Egon Momus had given back on 6319, and shivered. Even motionless, it had provoked an intense reaction in him, and the thought of such incredible destructive power being unleashed didn't bear thinking about. The hissing collection of silver struts and whirling cogs that encased scraps of flesh in a vaguely humanoid form must be the Mechanicum Adept Regulus, and Carcassy saw enough brass and medals hanging from puffed-out, uniformed chests to equip a battalion. Despite the presence of such luminaries, Carcassy found himself stifling a yawn as he and the rest of the audience listened to the Davenite Lodge Master, Tsai Rek, performing an elaborate chant in the local tongue. As interesting as it had been to see the bizarre, almost human locals, Carcassy knew that simply bearing witness to this interminable ceremony of welcome couldn't be the reason why Captain Loken had authorized his presence at the War Council. A bland-faced iterator named Yelton translated the lodge priest's speech into Imperial Gothic, the precisely modulated timbre of his voice carrying the words to the very edges of the yurt. Say what you like about the iterators, thought Carcassy. They can certainly enunciate to the back row.
How much longer is this going to go on for?
Whispered Euphrates Keeler, leaning in towards him. Dressed in her ubiquitous combat fatigues, chunky army boots and tight white vest top, Keeler looked every inch the spunky frontierswoman.
When is the War Master going to get here?
No idea, said Ignace, sneaking a look down her cleavage. A thin silver chain hung around her neck, whatever was hanging on it hidden beneath the fabric of her top.
My face is up here, Ignace, said Euphrates.
I know, my dear Euphrates, he said, but I'm terribly bored now, and this view is much more to my liking.
Give it up, Ignace. It's never going to happen.
He shrugged. I know, but it is a pleasant fiction, my dear, and the sheer impossibility of a quest is no reason to abandon it. She smiled, and Ignace knew that he was probably a little in love with Euphrates Keeler, though the time since the Xeno-beast had attacked her in the Whisperheads had been hard for her, and to be honest, he was surprised to see her here. She'd lost weight and wore her blonde hair scraped back in a tight ponytail, still beautifully feminine, despite her best attempts to disguise the fact. He'd once written an epic poem for the Marchioness Zorianne Delaquis, one of the supposed great beauties of the Terran court, a despicable commission that he'd loathed, but one that had paid handsomely. But her beauty was artificial and hollow compared to the vitality he now saw in Keeler's face, like someone born anew. Well out of his league, he knew, what with his generously proportioned physique, hang-dog eyes, and plain, round face. But his looks had never deterred Ignace Carcassy from attempting to seduce beautiful women. They just made it more of a challenge. He had made some conquests by riding the adulation from his earlier work, Reflections and Odes, garnering him several notable carnal tales, while other, more easily impressed members of the opposite sex had been seduced by his witty badinage. He already knew that Euphrates Keeler was too smart to fall for such obvious flattery, and contented himself with counting her simply as a friend. He smiled as he realized that he didn't think he'd ever had a woman as a friend before.
To answer your question seriously, my dear, he said, I hope the War Master will be here soon. My mouth's as dry as a Talon's sandal, and I could use a bloody drink.
Ignace, said Euphrates,
Spare us from those of moral fibre, he sighed. I didn't mean anything alcoholic. Though I could fair sink a bottle of that swill they drank on 6319 right about now. I thought you hated that wine, said Keeler. You said it was tragic. Ah, yes. But when you've been reduced to drinking the same vintage for months, it's surprising what you'll be willing to drink for a change. She smiled, placing her hand over whatever lay at the end of the chain around her neck, and said, I'll pray for you, Ignace. He felt a flicker of surprise at her choice of words, and then saw an expression of rapt adoration settle over her as she raised her picter at something behind him. He turned to see the door flap of the yurt pushed aside and the massive bulk of an Astartes ducked down as he entered. Carcassy did a slow double take as he saw that the warrior's shining plate armor was not that of the sons of Horus, but was the carved granite grey of the word-bearers. The warrior carried a staff crowned with a book draped in oath paper, over which wound a long sash of purple cloth. He had his helmet tucked into the crook of his arm, and seemed surprised to see all the remembrances there. Carcassy could see that the Astartes' wide-featured face was earnest and serious, his skull shaved and covered with intricate scriptwork. One shoulder guard of his armor was draped in heavy parchment, rich with illuminated letters, while the other bore the distinctive icon of a book with a flame burning in its center. Though he knew it symbolized enlightenment springing forth from the word, Carcassy instinctively disliked it. It spoke to his poet's soul of the death of knowledge, a terrible time in the history of ancient terror, when madmen and demagogues burnt books, libraries, and wordsmiths for fear of the ideas they might spread with their artistry. By Carcassy's way of thinking, such symbols belonged to heathens and Philistines, not Astartes charged with expanding the frontiers of knowledge, progress, and enlightenment. He smiled to himself at this delicious heresy, wondering if he could work it into a poem without Captain Loken realizing. But even as the rebellious thought surfaced, he quashed it. Carcassy knew that his patron was showing his work to the increasingly reclusive Kirill Sinderman. For all his dreariness, Sinderman was no fool when it came to the medium, and he would surely spot any risque references. In that case, Carcassy would quickly find himself on the next bulk hauler on its way back to Terra, regardless of his Astartes sponsorship. So who's that? He asked Keeler, returning his attention to the new arrival as Rek stopped his chanting and bowed towards the newcomer. The warrior, in turn, raised his long staff in greeting. Keeler gave him a sidelong glance, looking at him as though he had suddenly sprouted another head. Are you serious? She hissed. Never more so, my dear. Who is he? That, she said proudly, snapping off another pict of the Astartes warrior, is Erebus, first chaplain of the word-bearers. And suddenly, with complete clarity, Ignace Carcassy knew why Captain Loken had wanted him here. Stepping onto the dusty hardpan of Davin, Carcassy had been reminded of the oppressive heat of 6319. Moving clear of the prop wash of the shuttle's atmospheric rotors, he'd half run, half stumbled from beneath its deafening roar, with his exquisitely tailored robes flapping around him. Captain Loken had been waiting for him, resplendent in his armor of pale green, and apparently untroubled by the heat or the swirling vortices of dust.
Thank you for coming at such short notice, Ignace.
Not at all, sir, said Carcassy, shouting over the noise of the shuttle's engines as it lifted off the ground. I'm honoured, and not a little surprised, if I'm honest.
Don't be. I told you I wanted someone familiar with the truth, didn't I?
Yes, sir. Indeed you did, sir, beamed Carcassy. Is that why I'm here now?
In a manner of speaking, agreed Loken. You're an inveterate talker, Ignace, but today I need you to listen. Do you understand me?
I think so. What do you want me to listen to?
Not what, but who.
Very well. Who do you want me to listen to?
Someone I don't trust, said Loken. 3. A sheet of glass. A man of fine character. hidden words. On the day before making planetfall to the surface of Davin, Loken sought out Kirill Sinderman in Archive Chamber 3 to return the book he had borrowed from him. He made his way through the dusty stacks and piles of yellowed papers, lethargic globes of weak light bobbing just above head height, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly in the solemn hush. Here and there, a lone scholar clicked through the gloom in a tall stilt chair, but none was his old mentor. Loken travelled through yet another dizzyingly tall lane of manuscripts and leather-bound tomes, with names like Canticles of the Omniastran Dogma, Meditations on the Elegiac Hero, and Thoughts and Memories of Old Night. None of them was familiar, and he began to despair of ever finding Sinderman amidst this labyrinth of the arcane, when he saw the iterator's familiar, stooped form hunched over a long table and surrounded by collections of loose parchment, bound with leather cords, and piles of books. Sinderman had his back to him, and was so absorbed in his reading that, unbelievably, he didn't appear to have heard Loken's approach.
"More bad poetry?"
asked Loken, from a respectful distance. Sinderman jumped and looked over his shoulder with an expression of surprise, and the same furtiveness he had displayed when Loken had first met him here.
"Garviel,"
said Sinderman, and Loken detected a note of relief in his tone.
"Were you expecting someone else?"
No, not at all. I seldom encounter others in this part of the archive. The subject matter is a little lurid for most of the serious scholars."
Loken moved around the table and scanned the papers spread before Sinderman. Tightly curled, unintelligible script, sepia woodcuts depicting snarling monsters, and men swathed in flames. His eyes flicked to Sinderman, who chewed his bottom lip nervously at Loken's scrutiny.
"I must confess to have taken a liking to the old texts," explained Sinderman. "Like the Chronicles of Ursh I loaned you. It's bold, bloody stuff. Naive and overly hyperbolic, but stirring nonetheless."
"I have finished reading it, Kirill,"
said Loken, placing the book before Sinderman.
"And?"
"As you say, it's bloody, garish, and sometimes given to flights of fantasy.
But
I can't help thinking that you had an ulterior motive in giving me this book."
ulterior motive? No, Garviel. I assure you there was no such subterfuge," said Sinderman,
though Loken could not be sure that he believed him.
"Are you sure? There are passages in there that I think have more than a hint of truth to them."
"Come now, Garviel. Surely you can't believe that," scoffed Sinderman.
"The Merengen,"
stated Loken.
"Arnold Keyser's final battle against the Nordafric conclaves."
Sinderman hesitated.
"What about it?"
"I can see from your eyes that you already know what I'm going to say."
"No, Garviel, I don't. I know the passage you speak of, and, while it's certainly an exciting read, I hardly think you can take its prose too literally."
"I agree,"
nodded Loken.
"All the talk of the sky splitting like silk and the mountains toppling is clearly nonsense, but it talks of men becoming demons and turning on their fellows."
"Ah, now I see. You think that this is another clue as to what happened to Xavier Jubal?"
"Don't you?"
asked Loken, turning one of the yellowed parchments around to point at a fanged demon figure, clothed in fur, with curling ram's horns and a bloody, skull-stamped axe.
"Jubal turned into a demon and tried to kill me, just as happened to Arnold Keyser himself. One of his lieutenants, a man called Wilhelm Mardol, became a demon and killed him. Doesn't that sound familiar?"
Sinderman leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Loken saw how tired he looked, his skin the colour of the parchments he perused, and his clothes hanging from his body as though draped across his bare bones. Loken realized that the venerable iterator was exhausted.
"I'm sorry, Kirill,"
he said, also sitting back.
"I didn't come here to pick a fight with you."
Sinderman smiled, reminding Loken of how much he had come to rely on his wise counsel. Though not a tutor as such, Sinderman had filled the role of Loken's mentor and instructor for some time, and it had come as a great shock to discover that Sinderman did not have all the answers.
It's all right, Garville. It's good that you have questions. It shows you are learning that there is often more to the truth than what we see at first. I'm sure the War Master values that aspect of you. How is the commander?
Tired, admitted Logan. The demands of those crying for his attention grow more strident every day. Communiques from every expedition in the Crusade seek to pull him in all directions, and insulting directives from the Council of Terror seek to turn him into a damned administrator instead of the War Master. He carries a huge burden, Kirill. But don't you think you can change the subject that easily?
Sinderman laughed.
You are becoming too quick for me, Garville. Very well. What is it you want to know?
The men in the book, who were said to use sorcerer's powers, were they warlocks?
I don't know, admitted Sinderman. It's certainly possible. The powers they used certainly do not sound natural.
But how could their leaders have sanctioned the use of such powers? Surely they must have seen how dangerous it was.
Perhaps. But think on this. We know so little on the subject, and we have the light of the Emperor's wisdom and science to guide us. How much less must they have known?
Even a barbarian must know that such things are dangerous, said Logan.
Barbarian, said Sinderman. A pejorative term indeed, my friend. Do not be so quick to judge. We are not so different from the tribes of old Earth as you might think.
Surely you're not serious, asked Logan. We are as different from them as a star from a planet.
Are you so sure, Garville? You believe that the wall separating civilization from barbarism is as solid as steel, but it is not. I tell you the division is a thread, a sheet of glass. A touch here, a push there, and you bring back the reign of pagan superstition, fear of the dark and the worship of fell beings in echoing fanes.
You exaggerate.
Do I? Asked Sinderman, leaning forward. Imagine a newly compliant world that experiences a shortage of some vital resource, such as fuel, water, or food. How long would it take before civilized behavior broke down and barbaric behavior took over? Would human selfishness cause some to fight to get that resource at all costs, even if it meant harm to others and trafficking with evil? Would they deprive others of this resource or even destroy them in an effort to keep it for themselves? Common decency and civil behavior are just a thin veneer over the animal at the core of mankind that gets out whenever it has the chance.
You make it sound like there's no hope for us.
Far from it, Garville, said Sinderman, shaking his head. Mankind continually stands bewildered in the presence of its own creation, but thanks to the great works of the Emperor, I firmly believe that the time will come when we will rise to mastery of all before us. The time that has passed since civilization began is but a fragment of the duration of our existence, and but a fragment of the ages yet to come. The rule of the Emperor, brotherhood in society, equality in rights and privileges, and universal education foreshadow the higher plane of society to which our experience, intelligence, and knowledge are steadily tending. It will be a revival, in a higher form, of the liberty, equality, and fraternity of the ancient tribes of man before the rise of warlords like Callaghan or Nathan Doom.
Logan smiled.
And to think I thought you were in despair.
Sinderman returned Logan's smile and said,
No, Garville. Far from it. I admit I was shaken after the Whisperheads, but the more I read, the more I see how far we have come and how close we are to achieving everything we ever dreamed of. Each day, I am thankful that we have the light of the Emperor to guide us into this golden future. I dread what might become of us were he to be taken from us.
Don't worry, said Logan. That will never happen.
Aximand looked through a gap in the netting and said,
Erebus is here.
Horus nodded and turned to face the 4 members of the Mournival.
You all know what to do.
No, said Torgadden. We've completely forgotten. Why don't you remind us? Horus's eyes darkened at Tarek's levity, and he said,
Enough, Tarek. There is a time for jokes, and this isn't it. So keep your mouth shut.
Torgadden looked shocked at the War Master's outburst, and shot a hurt glance at his fellows. Loken was less shocked, having witnessed the commander raging at subordinates many times in the weeks since they had departed the marches of the Interrex. Horus had known no peace since the terrible bloodshed amid the House of Devices on Zenobia, and the deaths and the missed opportunity of unification with the Interrex haunted him still. Since the debacle with the Interrex, the War Master had withdrawn into a sullen melancholy, remaining more and more within his inner sanctum, with only Erebus to counsel him. The Mournival had barely seen their commander since returning to Imperial space, and they all keenly felt their exclusion from his presence. Where once they had offered the War Master their guidance, now only Erebus whispered in his ear. Thus it was with some relief that the Mournival heard that Erebus would take his leave of the expedition and journey ahead with his own legion to Davin. Even while en route to the Davin system, the War Master had not had a moment's peace. Repeated requests for aid or tactical assistance came to him from all across the galaxy, from brother Primarchs, army commanders, and, most loathed of all, the army of civil administrators who followed in the wake of their conquests. The exactors from Terra, led by a high administratrix called Enid Rathbone, plagued the War Master daily for assistance in their dispersal throughout the compliant territories to begin the collection of the Emperor's tithe. Everyone with an ounce of common sense knew that such a measure was premature, and Horus had done all he could to stall Rathbone and her exactors, but there was only so long they could be kept at bay.
If I had my choice,
Horus had told Loken one evening as they had discussed fresh ways of delaying the taxation of compliant worlds,
I would kill every exactor in the Imperium, but I'm sure we would be getting tax bills from hell before breakfast.
Loken had laughed, but the laughter had died in his throat when he realized that Horus was serious. They had reached Davin, and there were more important matters to deal with.
Remember, said Horus, this plays out exactly as I have told you.
A revered hush fell on the assemblage, and every person present dropped to one knee as the Emperor's chosen proxy made his entrance. Carcassy felt faint at the sight of the living god, arrayed as he was in a magnificent suit of plate armor the color of a distant ocean and a cloak of deepest purple. The eye of terror shone on his breast, and Carcassy was overcome by the magisterial beauty of the War Master. To have spent so long in the 63rd expedition and only now to lay eyes upon the War Master seemed the grossest waste of his time, and Carcassy resolved to tear out the pages he'd written in the Bondsman No. 7 this week and compose an epic soliloquy on the nobility of the commander. The Mournival followed him, together with a tall, statuesque woman in a crimson velveteen gown with high collars and puffed sleeves, her long hair worn in an impractical-looking coiffure. He felt his indignation rise as he realized this must be Vivar, the remembrancer from Terra that they had heard about. Horus raised his arms and said, Friends, I keep telling you that no one need kneel in my presence. Only the Emperor is deserving of such an honor. Slowly, as though reluctant to cease their veneration of this living god, the crowd rose to its feet as Horus passed amongst those closest to him, shaking hands and dazzling them with his easy charm and spontaneous wit. Carcassy watched the faces of those the War Master spoke to, feeling intense jealousy swell within his breast at the thought of not being so favored. Without thinking, he began pushing his way through the crowd towards the front, receiving hostile glares and the odd elbow to the gut for his troubles. He felt a tug on the collar of his robe and craned his neck to rebuke whoever had thought to handle his expensive garments so roughly. He saw Euphrates behind him and, at first, thought she was attempting to pull him back. But then he saw her face and smiled as he realized that she was coming with him, using his bulk like a plough. He managed to get within 6 or 7 people of the front, when he remembered why he had been allowed within this august body in the first place. He tore his eyes from the War Master to watch Erebus of the Word-Bearers. Carcassy knew little of the 17th Legion, save that its primarch, Lorgar, was a close and trusted brother of Horus. Both legions had fought and shed their blood together many times for the glory of the Imperium. The members of the Mournival came forward and, one by one, embraced Erebus as a long-lost brother. They laughed and slapped each other's armor in welcome, though Carcassy saw a measure of reticence in the embrace between Loken and Erebus.
"Focus, Ignace, focus," he whispered to himself as he found his gaze straying once again to the glory of the War Master. He tore his eyes from Horus in time to see Abaddon and Erebus shake hands one last time, and saw a gleam of silver pass between their palms. He couldn't be sure it had happened so fast, but it had looked like a coin, or medal of some sort. The Mournival and Viva then took up positions a respectful distance behind the War Master, as Malaghurst assumed his place at his master's side. Horus lifted his arms and said, "You must bear with me once again, my friends, as we gather to discuss our plans to bring truth and light to the dark places." Polite laughter and clapping spread towards the edges of the yurt as Horus continued. "Once again, we return to Davin, site of a great triumph, and the 8th world brought into compliance. Truly it is—" "War Master," came a voice from the center of the yurt. The word was spoken softly, and the audience let out a collective gasp at such a flagrant breach of etiquette. Carcassy saw the War Master's expression turn thunderous, understanding that he was obviously unused to being interrupted, before switching his scrutiny back to the speaker. The crowd drew back from Erebus, as though afraid that mere proximity to him might somehow taint them with his temerity.
"Erebus," said Malaghurst, "you have something to say?"
"Merely a correction, Equerry," explained the word-bearer. Carcassy saw Malaghurst give the War Master a wary sidelong glance.
"A correction, you say? What would you have corrected?"
"The War Master said that this world is compliant," said Erebus.
"Davin is compliant."
Erebus shook his head sadly, and for the briefest instant, Carcassy detected a trace of dark amusement in his next pronouncement. "No," said Erebus, "it is not." Loken felt his collar rise at this affront to their honor, and sensed the anger of the Mournival in the stiffening of their backs. Surprisingly, Aximand went so far as to reach for his sword, but Torgadon shook his head, and little Horus reluctantly removed his hand from his weapon. He had known Erebus for only a short time, but Loken had seen the respect and esteem the softly spoken chaplain of the Word-Bearers commanded. His counsel had been sage, his manner easy, and his faith in the War Master unshakable. But Erebus's subtle infiltration to the War Master's side had unsettled Loken in ways beyond simple jealousy. Since taking counsel from the first chaplain, the commander had become sullen, needlessly argumentative, and withdrawn. Malaghurst himself had expressed his concern to the Mournival over the word-bearer's growing influence upon the War Master. After a conversation with Erebus in the Vengeful Spirit's forward observation deck, Loken had known that there was more to the first chaplain than met the eye. Seeds of suspicion had been planted in his heart that day, and Erebus's words were now like fresh spring rain upon them. After the influence he had accumulated since Zenobia, Loken could hardly believe that Erebus would now choose to behave in such a boorish manner.
"Would you care to elaborate on that?"
asked Malaghurst, visibly struggling to keep his temper. Loken had never admired the equerry more.
"I would," said Erebus, "but perhaps these might be matters best discussed in private."
"Say what you have to say, Erebus. This is the War Council,
and there are no secrets here,"
said Horus, and Loken knew that whatever role the War Master had planned for them was an irrelevance now. He saw that the other members of the Mournival realized this too.
"My lord," began Erebus, "I apologize if—"
"Save your apology, Erebus," said Horus. "You have a nerve to come before me like this. I took you in and gave you a place at my war council, and this is how you repay me. With dishonor. With insolence. I'll not stand for it. I'll tell you that right now. Do you understand me?"
"I do, my lord. And no dishonor was intended. If you would allow me to continue, you will see that I mean no insult."
A crackling tension filled the yurt, and Loken silently willed the War Master to put an end to this farce and retire to somewhere more secluded. But he could see the War Master's blood was up, and there would be no backing down from this confrontation.
"Go on,"
said Horus, through gritted teeth.
"As you know, we left here 6 decades ago, my lord. Davin was compliant and seemed as though it would become an enlightened part of the Imperium. Sadly, that has not proved to be the case."
"Get to the point, Erebus," said Horus, his fists clenching in murderous balls.
"Of course. En route to Sardis and our rendezvous with the 203rd Fleet, the revered Lord Cor Pharaon bade me detour to Davin that I might ensure the word of the Emperor, beloved by all, was being maintained by Commander Temba and the forces left with him."
"Where is Temba, anyway?" demanded Horus. "I gave him enough men to pacify any last remnants of resistance. Surely, if this world was no longer compliant, I would have heard about it."
"Yugen Temba is a traitor, my lord," said Erebus. "He is on the moon of Davin and no longer recognizes the Emperor as his lord and master."
"Traitor!"
shouted Horus.
"Impossible! Yugen Temba was a man of fine character and admirable martial spirit. I chose him personally for this honor. He would never turn traitor."
"Would that were true, my lord," said Erebus,
sounding genuinely regretful.
"Well, what in the name of the Emperor is he doing on the moon?"
asked Horus.
"The tribes on Davin itself were honorable and readily accepted compliance, but those on the moon did not," explained Erebus. "Temba led his men in a glorious but ultimately foolhardy expedition to the moon to bring the tribes there into line."
"Why foolhardy? Such is the duty of an Imperial commander."
"It was foolhardy, my lord, for the tribes of the moon do not understand respect as we do, and it appears that when Temba attempted an honorable parley with them, they employed means to twist the perceptions of our men and turn them against you."
"Means?"
"Speak plainly, man," said Horus. "I hesitate to name them, my lord, but they are what might be described in the ancient texts as, well, sorcery."
Loken felt the humours in his blood swing wildly out of balance at this mention of sorcery, and a gasp of disbelief swept around the yurt at such a notion.
"Temba now serves the master of Davin's moon, and has spat on his oaths of loyalty to the Emperor. He names you as the lackey of a fallen god."
Loken had never met Yugen Temba, but he felt his hatred of the man rise like a sickness in his gorge at this terrible insult to the War Master's honor. An astonished wailing swept round the yurt as the assembled warriors felt this insult as keenly as he did.
"He will pay for this!" roared Horus. "I will tear his head off and feed his body to the crows! By my honor, I swear this!"
My lord," said Erebus, "I am sorry to be the bearer of such ill news, but surely this is a matter best left to those appointed beneath you."
"You would have me dispatch others to avenge this stain upon my honor, Erebus?" demanded Horus. "What sort of warrior do you take me for? I signed the decree of compliance here, and I'll be damned if the only world to backslide from the Imperium is one that I conquered."
Horus turned to the Mournival.
"Ready a spear tip, now!"
"Very well, my lord," said Abaddon. "Who shall lead it?"
"I will,"
said Horus. The War Council was dismissed, all other concerns and matters due before it shelved by this terrible development. A frantic vigor seized the 63rd Expedition as commanders returned to their units and word spread of Eugen Tember's treachery. Amid the urgent preparations for departure, Loken found Ignace Carcassy in the yurt so recently vacated by the incensed War Council. He sat with an open book before him, writing with great passion and pausing only to sharpen his nib with a small pocket-knife.
Ignace,
said Loken. Carcassy looked up from his work, and Loken was surprised at the amusement he saw in the remembrancer's face.
Quite a meeting, eh? Are they all that dramatic?
Loken shook his head.
No, not usually. What are you writing?
This? Oh, just a quick poem about the vile Tember, said Carcassy. Nothing special. Just a stream of consciousness kind of thing. I thought it appropriate given the mood of the expedition.
I know. I just can't believe anyone could say such a thing.
Nor I. And I think that's the problem.
What do you mean?
I'll explain,
said Carcassy, rising from his seat and making his way towards the untouched bowls of cold meat and helping himself to a plateful.
I remember a piece of advice I heard about the War Master. It was said that a good trick upon meeting him was to look at his feet, because if you caught his eye, you'd quite forget what it was you were going to say.
I have heard that too. Aximand told me the same thing.
Well, it's obviously a good piece of advice, because I was quite taken aback when I saw him up close for the first time. Quite magnificent. Almost forgot why I was there.
I'm not sure I understand,
said Loken, shaking his head as Carcassy offered him some meat from the plate.
Put it this way, can you imagine anyone who had actually met Horus? May I call him Horus? I hear you're not too fond of us mere mortals calling him that, saying such a thing as this Tember person is supposed to have said.
Loken struggled to keep up with Carcassy's rapid delivery, realizing that his anger had blinded him to the simple fact of the War Master's glory.
You're right, Ignace. No one who'd met the War Master could say such things.
So the question then becomes, why would Erebus say that Tember had said it?
I don't know. Why would he?
Carcassy swallowed some of the meat on his plate and washed it down with a drink of the white liquor.
Why indeed?
Asked Carcassy, warming to the weaving of his tale.
Tell me, have you had the pleasure of meeting Eilute Hergig? She's a remembrancer, one of the dramatists, and pens some dreadfully overwrought plays. Tedious things, if you ask me, but I can't deny that she has some skill in treading the boards herself. I remember watching her play Lady Ophelia in The Tragedy of Amleti, and she was really rather good, though—
Ignace, warned Loken, get to the point.
Oh, yes, of course. My point is that as talented an actress as Miss Hergig is, she couldn't hold a candle to the performance given by Erebus today.
Performance?
Indeed. Everything he did from the moment he entered this yurt was a performance. Didn't you see it?
No. I was too angry, admitted Loken. That's why I wanted you there. Explain it to me simply, and without digressions, Ignace.
Carcassy beamed in pride before continuing.
Very well. When he first spoke of Davin's non-compliance, Erebus suggested taking the matter somewhere more private. Yet he had just broached this highly provocative subject in a room full of people, and did you notice? Erebus said that Tember had turned against him, Horus, not the Emperor, Horus. He made it personal.
But why would he seek to provoke the War Master so?
Perhaps to unbalance his humor in order to bring his choler to the fore. It's not like he wouldn't have known what his reaction would be. I think Erebus wanted the War Master in a position where he wasn't thinking clearly.
Be careful, Ignace. Are you suggesting that the War Master does not think clearly?
No, said Carcassy. Only that with his humours out of balance, Erebus was able to manipulate him.
Manipulate him to what end?
Carcassy shrugged.
I don't know. But what I do know is that Erebus wants Horus to go to Davin's moon.
But he counselled against going there. He even had the nerve to suggest that others go in the War Master's place.
Carcassy shook his hand dismissively.
Only so as to look like he had tried to stop him from his course of action, while knowing full well that the War Master couldn't back down from this insult to his honour.
And nor should he, Remembrancer,
said a deep voice at the entrance to the yurt. Carcassy jumped, and Loken turned at the sound of the voice to see the first captain of the Sons of Horus, resplendent and huge in his plate armour.
Ezekiel,
said Loken.
What are you doing here?
Looking for you,
said Abaddon.
You should be with your company. The War Master himself is to lead the spear tip, and you waste time with scriveners who call into question the word of an honourable Astartes.
First Captain Abaddon, breathed Carcassy, lowering his head.
I meant no disrespect. I was just apprising Captain Loken of my impressions of what I heard. Be silent, worm, snapped Abaddon. I should kill you where you stand for the dishonour you do to Erebus.
Ignace was just doing what I asked him to do,
Loken pointed out.
You put him up to this, Garviel? Asked Abaddon. I'm disappointed in you.
There's something not right about this, Ezekiel, said Loken. Erebus isn't telling us everything.
Abaddon shook his head.
You wouldn't take this fool's word over that of a brother Astartes? Your dalliance with petty wordsmiths has turned your head around, Loken. The commander shall hear of this.
I sincerely hope so, said Loken, his anger growing at Abaddon's easy dismissal of his concerns. I will be standing next to you when you tell him.
The first captain turned on his heel and made to leave the yurt.
First Captain Abaddon, said Carcassy, might I ask you a question? No, you may not, snarled Abaddon, but Carcassy asked anyway. What was the silver coin you gave Erebus when you met him?
4. Secrets and hidden things. Chaos. Spreading the word. Audience. Abaddon froze at Carcassy's words. Loken recognized the signs and quickly moved to stand between the first captain and the Remembrancer. Ignace, get out of here, he shouted, as Abaddon turned and lunged for Carcassy. Abaddon roared in anger, and Loken grabbed his arms, holding him at bay as Carcassy squealed in terror and bolted from the yurt. Abaddon pushed Loken back, the first captain's massive strength easily greater than his. Loken tumbled away, but he had achieved his objective in redirecting Abaddon's wrath. You would raise arms against a brother, Loken, bellowed Abaddon. I just saved you from making a big mistake, Ezekiel, replied Loken, as he climbed to his feet. He could see that Abaddon's blood was up, and knew that he must tread warily. Aximand had told him of Abaddon's berserk rages during the desperate extraction of the commander from the Extranus, and his temper was becoming more and more unpredictable. A mistake? What are you talking about? Killing Ignace, said Loken. Think what would have happened if you'd killed him. The War Master would have had your head for that. Imagine the repercussions if an Astartes murdered a Remembrancer in cold blood.
Abaddon furiously paced the interior of the yurt like a caged animal. But Loken could see that his words had penetrated the red mist of his friend's anger.
Damn it, Loken. Damn it, hissed Abaddon. What was Ignace talking about, Ezekiel? Was it a lodge medal that passed between you and Erebus?
Abaddon looked directly at Loken and said,
I can't say.
Then it was.
I can't say.
Damn you, Ezekiel. Secrets and hidden things, my brother. I can't abide them. This is exactly why I can't return to the Warrior Lodge. Aximand and Torgadon have both asked me to, but I won't. Not now. Tell me, is Erebus part of the Lodge now? Was he always part of it, or did you bring him in on the journey here?
You heard Sergar's words at the meeting. You know I can't speak of what happens within the circles of the Lodge.
Loken stepped in close to Abaddon, chestplate to chestplate, and said,
You'll tell me now, Ezekiel. I smell something rank here, and I swear if you lie to me, I'll know.
You think to bully me, little one?
Laughed Abaddon, but Loken saw the lie in his bluster.
Yes, Ezekiel, I do. Now tell me.
Abaddon's eyes flickered to the entrance of the yurt.
Very well, he said. I'll tell you. But what I say goes no further.
Loken nodded, and Abaddon said,
We did not bring Erebus into the lodge.
No? Asked Loken, his disbelief plain.
No,
repeated Abaddon.
It was Erebus who brought us in.
Erebus. Brother Astartes, first chaplain of the Word-Bearers, trusted counselor of the War Master, liar. No matter how much he tried to blot the word out with his battle meditation, it kept coming back to haunt him. In response, Euphrates Keeler's words, from the last time they had spoken, swirled around his head over and over. She had stared him down and asked, "If you saw the rot, a hint of corruption, would you step out of your regimented life and stand against it?"